list at number 14 is the Thunderfoot Tribe warrior THawk. Though mostly known for his endeavors in trying to take down Mbison over the years for what he had done to his father and his girlfriend during the events of the Street Fighter Alpha era, primarily in Street Fighter Alpha 3, THawk had found himself in a position where he could finally extract his revenge against Mbison, which was established during the Street Fighter 6 recordings that Mbison was indeed dominating the fight against the two, but then THawk managed to slam Mbison 2 times onto the ground, however chose to walk away for unknown reasons. Of course, we know that Mbison inevitably got back up as the events of the Street Fighter Alpha 3 game still play out. However, regardless of that, this is definitely more than likely the best place to put THawk in comparison to the rest of the cast during the Street Fighter Alpha era altogether. Next up on the list at number 13 is Adon, who during the Alpha era will become the new god of Muay Thai. No matter how many times he would end up losing a fight, he would always find a way to get back up and either challenge Sagot or anybody else that is in front of him. This is not only shown where in Street Fighter Alpha 1, where he blatantly beat Sagot without any mental nerfs or physical nerfs, but this as well would be the same Sagot who was the Muay Thai champion for years on end, and would be the same Sagot who in Street Fighter lore was capable of fighting Ryu head to head in an extremely difficulty fight, with Ryu ultimately defeating Sagot, with Adon's victory over Sagot catching the attention of that of Mbison, who would inevitably attempt to try to recruit him into the Shadowloon organization, with Adon of course turning it down, as while he may be cocky and arrogant, he is not a common criminal, nor would he be willing to align himself with terrorists. We then see with Adon his ambitions rise even higher throughout the Alpha trilogy, as we see in Alpha 2, where Adon accidentally and inevitably crosses paths with that of Akuma, with Adon challenging Akuma, telling him to show him his murderous intent, with Akuma responding with, "Don't talk, just fight." Akuma utterly dominated Adon, and although Adon ultimately loses to Akuma, he did earn Akuma's respect, with Akuma choosing to let him live instead of just, well, outright killing him. Adon would inevitably also challenge that of Mbison, but unfortunately for Adon, Mbison had become far more powerful using that of Psycho Power, with Mbison scoffing at Adon, essentially mocking him, asking him if that was all he actually had to offer. This as well would lead to an intervention from a certain someone that did not happen, but we'll get to that a little later. Overall, Adon during the Street Fighter Alpha era definitely proved himself as a worthy combatant amongst the other legendary warriors in the world of Street Fighter. Next up at number 12 is, ironically enough, the former emperor slash god of Muay Thai, Sagot. The former multiple-time world champion in that of Muay Thai, and the, at the time, nemesis of Ryu, would be the same Sagot who would be capable of fighting Ryu in an extremely difficulty fight, although ultimately losing to Ryu, depending on which version of the lore of the fight you want to go off of, either being one-shotted by Ryu using the Shoryuken, being off-guarded by an evil Ryu, or in a technical matter, quote-unquote, defeating Ryu and then attempting to help Ryu get back up just for him to be cheap-shotted by Ryu. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you, Ryu was kind of a poor sport back in the day. And despite Sagot's loss and, well, ultimately near-death experience against Ryu, his fight against the Wandering Warrior ultimately caught the eyes and the attention of that of Mbison, who would inevitably recruit Sagot not only because of his overwhelming dominant strength, but as well as Sagot's desire to defeat and, well, at the time, kill Ryu. Sagot, of course, would inevitably confront Ryu during the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3 and challenge him to a battle. Ryu, during the events of the Street Fighter Alpha era, was somewhat kind of going through it, even during their fight, not only because of what he did to Sagot, nearly killing him, but on top of figuring out that Akuma killed his father figure slash master Kotetsu, of which this would be the same Ryu who would, prior to fighting Sagot, would inevitably cross paths with Akuma in a fight, but then Akuma ultimately destroys his home island, leaving Ryu with more questions than answers, and as well ultimately questioning himself. Sagot during his fight with Ryu was able to knock Ryu back into his senses and get him back into the fight. This as well also backed up by the 30th anniversary for the Street Fighter Alpha series. And although Ryu had become stronger since his last fight with Sagot during the events of the Street Fighter 1 era, Sagot, despite all of that, was still able to fight relative to Ryu point blank period, of which would undisputably grant Sagot the title of 12th place strongest fighter during the Street Fighter Alpha era during this point in the franchise. The next two characters on the list at 11 and 10 are going to be talked about around the exact same time due to the context of how these two characters, well, function not only in the verse, but as well with each other and their placement in power throughout the franchise, with number 11 being Ryu and number 10 being, well, Ken. Now, before you dumbass diehard Ryu fans start losing your shit, chill out, grab a joint or a beer, or I don't know, a fucking Benadryl, and just sit down and let me explain. A lot of people, primarily biased people in the Street Fighter community, are of the opinion that, well, Ryu dog was Ken. Ken is absolute fodder. He doesn't even come close to Ryu. Ryu just has better everything. Even though that in itself is just objectively not true. Ken and Ryu as characters are designed to be eternal rivals with each other, pretty much being near equals with pretty much every category that is relevant, with Ken being just as capable of beating Ryu as Ryu is just as capable of beating Ken, as both Ken and Ryu have wins and losses against each other throughout the years, even going all the way as far back as their years of training together. Regardless of all that, both Ryu and Ken go through a tremendous amount during the Alpha era respectively until their inevitable crossovers, with them fighting each other more than once during the trilogy. Bear in mind, this would be the same Ryu who is going through a tremendous amount mentally and physically, as he is still coming to terms with the fact that he nearly killed Sagot, with him coming to the realization that he nearly succumbed to that of the Dark Hado entirely, which then begins his quest to figure out whether or not what type of warrior he wants to become, whether it be a warrior who uses Satsui no Hado and fights with murderous intent, or a warrior who goes off on his own journey. Ryu then down his journey would inevitably cross paths with a character in that of Rose, who then challenges Ryu to help him see beyond his current self. Rose has an ability where she's capable of seeing the future and future actions of the opponent that she is facing, as that is the one of many abilities that comes with her using a power known as Soul Power, the, well, opposite of Psycho Power. Despite many of her techniques and her abilities, she still inevitably loses to Ryu. But before Ryu's departure from the battlefield, Rose begins to comfort Ryu, establishing to him that the answers that he's seeking in context to what type of warrior he wishes to be ultimately has to come from himself and within his own heart and soul. Ryu keeps this in mind as he inevitably crosses paths with Julie and defeats her right then and there, staying true to his morality and his integrity as a warrior. Ryu, as well, during his journey also crosses paths with Akuma, who he finds out Akuma was the one who killed his master Goken, and challenges him in a fight, with Akuma inevitably overwhelming Ryu with his overall power and very violent nature in this fighting style of Ansatsuken, with Akuma inevitably one-shotting the shit out of his own home island, leaving Ryu pretty much all alone in the middle of the water, which in turn his battle with Akuma making him question himself even more, of which during his journey he would inevitably cross paths with Ken. Ken, being his longtime friend and rival, realizes that Ryu is in heavy distress and challenges him to a fight to pretty much help him get back on his feet mentally and physically. This would be the same Ken who as well would go through his own journey within the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy as a whole. As established earlier, Ken would also be the same character who would inevitably defeat characters such as Sakura and Karin, who both admit after the defeat against Ken that they need to continue the training in order to reach any level similar to Ken and Ryu. Ken, during his story, would once again inevitably cross paths with Ryu. As mentioned in Ryu's story, Ken would notice that Ryu is heavily down in the dumps, with Ken challenging Ryu to a fight in an attempt to help him get back in the fighting spirit, with Ken ultimately defeating Ryu, establishing to Ryu that he needs to learn to find his own path, and if Ryu ever inevitably goes down that dark path, he would be there to stop Ryu. Some people, in an attempt to defend Ryu, because again there are so many diehard Ryu fans out there that essentially try to downplay this victory that Ken has over Ryu, essentially saying, oh, well, Ryu wasn't really in his right mind, therefore he was extraordinarily nerfed, therefore that win didn't count. And while it is true that Ryu wasn't fully within the right mind space during the first two games of the original trilogy, to sit here and say that he became demonstrably weaker to allow himself to lose to Ken is extraordinarily disingenuous towards both of these characters and the relationship that they have. This is Ryu and Ken we're talking about, two characters who have known each other since they were children, who not only grew up together under the same mentor, but were established numerous times by said mentor, which once again is expanded upon in Assassin's Fist, that every single time they were to have an encounter with each other, to put aside their friendship and to fight each other as adversaries, with Ken and Ryu fighting each other a total of 3 different times seriously against each other, with Ken winning all 3 times. Every single time Ken and Ryu battle each other, they're always battling each other with the attempt to try to best one another, as that is what they were trained to do whenever it came to fights between Ryu and Ken. So to sit here and say that Ryu just gave Ken the win, or that he was so mentally distraught that he just wasn't trying against Ken, is extraordinarily disingenuous toward both of these characters and the relationship that they have toward each other, both as brothers, best friends, and as eternal rivals. Of course, this fight during Street Fighter Alpha 1 would not be the first time that both of these characters would cross over with each other and combat against each other, as Ken and Ryu would both have 2 more fights toward each other during the Alpha trilogy, both of which happened during the Street Fighter Alpha 3 game, with the next fight being given to Ken as it was established within Ken's story mode in Street Fighter 5, where in the game there is a flashback to the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy era, where Ken and Ryu have a battle after Ken inevitably ends up in a relationship with his girlfriend, soon-to-be wife Elizabeth, with Ken ultimately defeating Ryu pretty soundly, with Ryu establishing to Ken that he's going to win the next one. Despite this, during the Alpha 3 game, Ken goes through a bit of a mental crisis, with his insecurities getting the better of him on whether or not he'll become a true master, with some of these insecurities also being shown with his performances with all the fights that he has during the Street Fighter Alpha 3 game, of which Dan, unfortunately due to his luck, inevitably crosses paths with Mbison, then capturing Ken and torturing him, infecting him with psycho power, completely and utterly brainwashing Ken, forcing Ken to fight Ryu in a third and final encounter, with Ryu successfully being capable of defeating this brainwashed, nerfed Ken, which then leads into the ultimate climactic final battle between Ryu and Mbison, of which during their battle, Mbison attempts to take over Ryu's mind, body, and soul with psycho power, but Ryu remembers the lessons that he learned with every single one of his fights, including the words of wisdom that was passed on to him by Rose, and was able to break free from psycho power and the Satsui no Hado, effectively killing Mbison with a final blow, temporarily putting an end to the Shadowloo Empire, but as well being the only character within the Street Fighter roster who canonically defeats and kills Mbison. Well, kinda kills Mbison. You'll find out as you play the rest of the games. But with both Ryu and Ken's journey complete during the Alpha era, this would heavily establish that Ryu and Ken are both capable of besting each other in a fight. But during the Alpha era, Ken is slightly stronger than Ryu and is capable of beating Ryu more times than not, establishing that Ryu would indeed be at number 11th in this list, with Ken being in the top 10 pretty soundly. Next on the list at number 9 is the infamous DJ. DJ does establish himself as a very formidable opponent during this trilogy pretty blatantly, as he not only was capable of being able to defeat Sagot, but as well would be the same person who after defeating him would be confronted by Mbison, which was confirmed in Street Fighter 6, of which it is established that during DJ's encounter with Mbison, he was successfully capable of evading some of Mbison's attacks, which would be the same ones that Mbison successfully was able to use on Maki, Adon, Ryu, and Ken, with DJ being able to evade Mbison's attacks while simultaneously being able to land multiple attacks onto Mbison during their encounter. With all of this massive inverse over the vast majority of the characters would indeed establish that DJ would be at 9th place in the overall list for the Street Fighter Alpha era, which leads us entering into number 8, being that of Guy. No, I'm not kidding, that's his actual name. Guy has always remained one of the top echelon of fighters with his sheer skill and training, as Guy has already mentioned was already able to defeat Maki, another Bushin Ryu master, as Guy's master Zenku challenges him to make sure that he is ready to become the successor of this fighting style, with the martial arts style in question being the legendary Bushin Ryu fighting style. And with no surprise, Guy was able to defeat his master Zenku, only to be told soon that the world will be impacted by a great evil very soon and it is up to him to stop it, which was clearly in reference to the influence of Shadowloo being led by Mbison. This warning told by his master heavily left a massive impact onto Guy throughout the events of the Alpha trilogy leading up to the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3, as Guy would inevitably be forced to cross paths with Mbison, making his master's statement that much more of a reality, as when Guy inevitably confronts and fights Mbison, he is capable of causing so much damage to him that in Street Fighter 4, when he confronts Mbison again for tampering with Rose, Bison immediately leaves the battlefield and leaves Rose to him and doesn't even put up a fight. Again, we have to remember that this is Mbison we're talking about, the overall bad guy of the Street Fighter franchise as a whole, aside from a few other major antagonists within the franchise that would come down the line. Regardless of all of that, his performance towards Mbison would solidify him at number 8 in the top 10 of the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy, with us now coming in at 7th place being that of Cody, the former hero of Metro City. Cody throughout the Alpha trilogy has a tremendous amount of high relativity scaling toward a lot of the characters within this list. Not only is Cody the same character who has a tremendous amount of relativity scaling to characters like Guy and Hacker back during the original Final Fight games, but Cody himself sheds a tremendous amount of new light on the subject of their overall skill, as when Guy during the Alpha trilogy inevitably confronts a fresh out of prison break Cody, attempting to put Cody back behind bars. Cody actually defeats Guy and never even implies or mentions that Guy has gotten stronger or faster since their last encounter during the original Final Fight games. He just establishes to Guy that when it comes to the dynamic between the two, this is how it is and how it'll always be. As Guy himself even establishes that even during the Final Fight saga, Cody has always been Guy's superior with pure martial skill and as well with better street instincts. And not to mention, when inside the Cycle Drive's underground base, he was capable of one-shotting the absolute shit out of one of the revived dolls that even Guy thought would be difficult to deal with. So yeah, it's pretty clear that Cody is pretty blatantly above Guy, cementing his spot at number 7 in this list. Next up on the list at number 6 is the infamous Rolanto, the former Red Beret who joined the gang that nearly took over the entire city. There are indeed some people who might believe that the Mag Gear's finest deserves to be this high within the list, while many people believe he should only have relativity to characters in that of Sondom, as they both fought each other and were both a part of the Mad Gears. It is heavily established within the 30th anniversary that Rolanto did indeed caught up with Cody and was disappointed in what he saw. This means that before entering into the secret point, Rolanto must have either defeated Cody or at least kept him occupied for a while, as Rolanto made his way inside of the Cycle Drive's underground base and manages to escape all of them at the same time thanks to Sondom, of which would still be consistent as he was capable of being able to do the same thing to Seth during the Street Fighter IV era. So it really isn't that unbelievable that Rolanto was able to display the same feats, of which would ultimately establish Rolanto being at the 6th spot within the top 10 of the Street Fighter Alpha era list. Moving on to the top 5 at, well, number 5 is indeed that of Charlie Nash. There really isn't a whole lot of introduction that really needs to be made about Guile, as Charlie's hunger for justice is ultimately put to the test, especially during this era of the Street Fighter franchise, with the first test being established in Street Fighter Alpha 1, where he busted Mbison for drug dealing while simultaneously getting his fellow comrades into such degenerate behavior without actually catching him, implying that he did indeed escape that day. The second happens during the events of Street Fighter Alpha 2, where he is trying to figure out Shadowlu's connections with the military, of which he once again fails to capture Mbison but is given more clues in an attempt to figure out a way to stop him. However, it's during the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3 where he realizes that Shadowlu's interventions could be far more clear to him, as he was forced to move to a completely separate jurisdiction for snooping around to the things that he wasn't supposed to look into, further establishing that not only Mbison but Shadowlu as a whole completely compromised the totality of his branch in the military, with moving Charlie for the sole purpose of making sure that Charlie does not interfere with any of his affairs. However, unknown to Mbison, Charlie manages to put together a small task force in an attempt to take out all of the evil corporates that Mbison and Shadowlu as a whole managed to sneak into the military, with Charlie and his task force ultimately sneaking into the military base, with Charlie stealing one of the military aircrafts in an attempt to track down Mbison and take him down, with Charlie inevitably finding the dictator and attempts to take him down, fighting him all alone until inevitably being helped by that of Guile. And it is the teamwork of both Guile and Charlie that they are successfully capable of defeating Mbison, forcing him to retreat. Charlie and Mbison would inevitably cross paths again, and even with Mbison's new body being far more powerful than what he was by the end of the Alpha series, Charlie was still capable of defeating this newly amplified Mbison until inevitably being betrayed by his comrades, giving Mbison the opportunity to sneak Charlie from behind and ultimately defeating Charlie right then and there. And while Mbison did indeed defeat Charlie that day, it is heavily established within the Street Fighter lore with pretty much nearly every iteration of that fight in other games that Charlie was indeed fighting relative to Mbison and would have defeated him had his comrades not betrayed him. This is also heavily established in Street Fighter V, where a practically alive but not completely dead Charlie Nash, inside of his somewhat repaired body, was capable of fighting relative to Mbison and pulling off some form of a win, even though he still died, but in the end, he was still capable of fighting relative to Mbison, who was indeed in an amplified state throughout the totality of Street Fighter V's main storyline. So yeah, it's pretty clear that all of Charlie Nash's clear-cut showcases would further consistently establish that he would indeed be within the top 5 of this tier list as a whole. Coming in at number 4 is the infamous and beauty-striking Rose. Rose as a character has always been established to be a user of something known as soul power. Soul power is a form of spiritual energy that is the complete opposite of psycho power, with Rose herself, aside from characters like Ryu using the power of nothingness, believes that she's the only one capable of being able to truly completely defeat Mbison without him attempting to reincarnate himself into other bodies in his attempts to take over the world with a mighty fist. Now, at first glance, from an outside perspective, this would indeed be Rose just boasting herself, but that's actually not the case, as she has proven herself time and time again throughout the franchise and within the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy, as she not only was capable of being able to fight relative to Mbison in an extremely high difficulty fight in Street Fighter Alpha 1, even with bits of Mbison's soul seeping into her body, she was still capable of being able to extreme def Mbison right then and there during the events of the first game. She does then eventually gain a premonition about Mbison's return during Street Fighter Alpha 2, and during the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3, she inevitably decides to track down Ryu in an attempt to have him join her and use Ryu as backup in case something went wrong, of which after the fact both Rose and Ryu travel together, with Rose easily being able to one-shot that of Vega, and then inevitably crosses paths with Mbison and is blatantly capable of defeating him on a similar tier of difficulty, leaving Ryu to finish the job against killing Mbison. Well, again, temporarily killing him. However, regardless of all that, when it comes to Rose, pretty much with every single interaction that she's had within the Street Fighter Alpha series would indeed heavily establish that she would be higher within this list, easily placing her at number 4th. At 3rd place, we have the infamous Mbison, the infamous dictator and leader of the terrorist organization known as Shadowloo, and the overall, well, villain of the Street Fighter franchise, excluding from a few other characters down the line. And being one of the big bads of the franchise, he would as well logically be one of the strongest characters within the verse that our main heroes would be forced to face. But just going over the top 11 characters within this tier, it's pretty clear where he stands in comparison to the rest. Ryu does indeed have relativity scaling to Mbison and was capable of ultimately beating him in the end. However, he was still nearly succumbed to that of Psycho Power and needed the power of nothingness in order to break free from it in order to kill Mbison. Whereas Ken, on the other hand, ultimately did succumb to that of Psycho Power, which makes sense as Mbison had to jump Ken just to be able to brainwash him with Psycho Power to use him as a minion. And the fact that Psycho Power is Mbison's main ability, the same thing would have easily happened to that of Adon and Sagot had Sagot chosen not to turn on Mbison. And while Rose has the best relativity scaling toward Mbison aside from the next 2 characters that will be mentioned in this list, she wasn't nearly as successful in finishing Mbison, as he would inevitably always find a way to come back. It's also heavily important to note that when it came to Mbison, he was able to draw so much negative energy, so much hatred, and so much violence throughout the entire world. He was able to amplify himself so much in Psycho Power to the point where he was pretty much able to fight almost every single character in Street Fighter Alpha 3, as he was able to fight a large number of the cast without a single break until having to go back to the Cycle Drive to recharge himself afterwards, eventually forcing everyone to confront Mbison in a tournament gauntlet style fight to inevitably attempting to jump the dictator if anything, which in turn ultimately led to his overall defeat by the end of Street Fighter Alpha 3, of which he would not be seen for a short amount of time, all the way up until the Street Fighter 2 era where they would all prepare for the tournament. And I'm pretty sure if we know anything about the Street Fighter 2 lore, we pretty much know how that went for him. All in all, this would comfortably establish that Mbison during the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy would sit in the top 3 of the strongest characters within the trilogy, with the last 2 combatants in this tier list being that of Gen and the infamous Akuma. Where you choose to have one character over the other is indeed somewhat up for debate, especially when it comes to the context of their first encounter during the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy, and as well with the unknown results of their second encounter by the end of the trilogy. Akuma's story and role within the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy isn't really that important, especially since this is Akuma post killing his brother Gouken and then choosing to travel around the world and search for an opponent to test his skills against, and as well ultimately to find a worthy adversary that he can challenge to in a battle to the death. Gen, on the other hand, has a bit more going for him in terms of plot and lore, as he is traveling around the world with the sole purpose of finding a worthy opponent, while also simultaneously dealing with the fact that he has a terminal illness attempting to kill him. They don't really have much involvement when it comes to the overall plot in taking down Mbison, but they do interact with the vast majority of the cast members during the Alpha trilogy as a whole, with Akuma inevitably fighting characters such as Adon and Ryu, with Gen fighting characters like Chun-Li, Ryu, Vega, Birdie, Guy, Sagat, with even Akuma fighting and defeating that of Mbison during the trilogy as a whole. Essentially, both combatants pretty much go down the vast majority of the roster, fighting numerous opponents and obviously beating these vast opponents, showcasing their overall dominance in their martial arts and their overall levels of power, establishing that not only are they the most powerful within the verse during the time, but also the most skilled in terms of their martial prowess, which makes sense as both of them, within their respective styles, are labeled as Ansatsuken Masters in their respective styles, and which these two characters would indeed inevitably cross paths with each other 2 different occasions during the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy. It is heavily important to note that despite Gen's illness, he was still capable of being able to put up an extremely difficult fight with Akuma, but as well was able to land some very powerful and nearly deadly blows onto the Raging Demon, with Akuma being able to land some back at him, which would overall act as not only a learning experience for Akuma, but also would allow him to gain some real clear-cut resistances against things like deadly pressure points. This is heavily backed up for the Street Fighter Alpha lore for the 30th anniversary of the Street Fighter franchise. While Akuma does inevitably defeat Gen via through outskilling him and overpowering him, part of the reason why Gen was able to lose to Akuma was because of his terminal illness, of which Akuma would recognize and would see that Gen is not at his 100% best, and instead of finishing Gen, leaves him in the street to inevitably cross paths with him again by the end of the trilogy, with the outcome of the fight being unknown. However, it's heavily speculated that the fight ended in a draw. So if you go just based on their interactions, not only with other characters within the roster and with, well, each other, and taking things into context, it's a little bit hard to argue who really is superior in comparison to the other. However, I would argue Akuma over Gen, that despite Gen's illness, he was still capable of being able to fight relative to a character as powerful, as fast, and as dangerous in that of Akuma, with Akuma himself being able to overcome the challenges that Gen was placing in front of him via through outskilling him and overpowering him, while simultaneously gaining new resistances that he would use down the line, as after the events of the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy leading up to Street Fighter V, Gen and Akuma would once again cross paths with each other again, with Gen's illness no longer holding him back, with Akuma easily being able to overpower and kill Gen right then and there. And yes, it is important to note that Akuma had indeed surpassed the overall levels of power during Street Fighter V in comparison to where he was in Street Fighter Alpha 3, to the point where even Gen acknowledged that Akuma pretty much became a raging demon god. The fight does indeed demonstrate that if Gen didn't have his terminal illness holding him back, Akuma still would have ultimately defeated Gen as he did during their first encounter, once again, via through outskilling him and overpowering him with his overall aggression and his own Ansatsuken techniques. So as far as I am concerned, Akuma would be at number 1 as the strongest character during the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy, with Gen coming in at a pretty solid second. However, I will leave it up to your interpretation on whether or not you think Gen is over Akuma or Akuma is over Gen.